I'm Kamal Chomani, editor-in-chief of the Amargi, an independent new media platform based in Leipzig here in Germany. The Amargi tries to be a democratic voice of the peoples of the region with a focus on Kurdistan, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and the broader Middle East. The Middle East is going through major changes with new alliances and shifting power as countries compete for hegemony. Since October 7, 2023, the role of local, regional, and global powers in the Middle East has changed dramatically. To help us understand these complexities of the new power dynamics in the region, I'm joined by Professor Hamit Bozarslan, one of the leading scholars of the Middle East. Professor Hamit Bozarslan is an expert of the Middle East, Turkey, and the Kurdish question. Since 2006, he has served as director of studies at the École des Hautes Études and Sciences Sociales. I don't speak French, but School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. His research has now focused on the historical and political sociology of the Middle East, revolutionary movements and violence in the Arab world, and the rise of anti-democratic regimes in 21st century. Welcome, Professor Hamid.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and congratulations and a lot of success for your media group.
And I'm sure with the help of you and other friends and scholars and journalists, we will be hopefully a democratic voice of the region. So let's begin with a big question. From the Iranian grain movement to the Arab Spring to the Ghazi protests in Turkey, moments when hopes for democratization of Middle East were high. The region, however, today seems to be moving further toward authoritarianism, including in Israel. How should we understand these new changes in the Middle East? Can we say that the Middle East will be for years again or continually dominated by the anti-democratic regimes that you have published a book and you have spent years on understanding the democratic regimes in the region, Iran, Turkey, and the wider region? Or this is a moment where the fragility of the nation states that has been imposed on the peoples of the Middle East, mainly the minorities, have further appeared, and it is time to see or to be able to imagine a new Middle East in the future.
In any case, I think that it is time to imagine a new Middle East. That's absolutely obvious. And at the same time, I think that we can take maybe three times frameworks, which are overlapping frameworks. The first one starts in 1979 with the occupation of Afghanistan, with the Iranian Revolution, which started as a left-wing revolution actually, but it turned it to an Islamic revolution. The recognition of Israel by Egypt, the insurrection in Kaaba, in Mecca, and all these events actually marked a very dramatic change in the sense that the Middle East has become the arena of continuous war, Iran-Iraq war, to the war of Afghanistan, the acceleration of war in Lebanon. And I think that together with that, we also saw the reinforcement of authoritarian, if not totalitarian regimes like in countries like Syria and Iraq. And that meant that not only the left-wing movements have been marginalized, but also that social conservatism, that sectarianism, religious sectarianism, that authoritarianism, they have win in momentum, and the societies have been tremendously fragilized. A second time frame that we can take is after 2011, the beginning of the Arab uprising, revolutionary uprisings, and you mentioned that these uprisings, they have failed. That's not the first time in the world history. When you take, for instance, what happened in 1848 in Europe, you had a series of democratic revolutions or democratic revolutionary contests, and these democratic revolutionary contests, they failed. And for Marx, at that moment, it is a huge epistemological crisis. He thought that Europe will enter into a new phase of emancipation of humankind. But at the end, they have in Europe the authoritarian regimes like Bonapartism or reinforcement of the autocratic regimes. And the third stage, third time framework is of course after 2007, 2023, 7th of October. And I think that the tragic errors of Hezbollah, of Hamas, and after of Hezbollah led to the shaping of a new Middle East that has accelerated the failure of the democracy in Israel, of course, because today in Israel we see a democracy which is literally speaking, a dying democracy with a huge devastation campaign in Gaza, but not only in Gaza, we see also the devastation uh, in the West Bank. And at the same time, these events led to the changes in Lebanon. The Hezbollah movement, which was the main actor, actually military actor, even before this, the Lebanese army has become a quite marginalized actor. The Syrian regime, which was protected by Hezbollah, by Iran, and by Russia, has fallen. And today we have a new Middle East. No one knows to which distinction, which orientation this Middle East will take. And as you know, the historians are very careful. The historians makes no prediction. We don't know what will happen tomorrow, but at the same time, we are in this situation since almost 50 years. Millions of people have disappeared, and the generations successive generations. They dreamed a lot about a lot of things, but they have finally experienced an empty, sterile life. And today it is time to leave aside this dynamic of Thanatos, Thanatos meaning the god of death, the cult of Thanatos, the cult of death, the cult of religious sectarianism, the cult of social conservatism, in order to imagine another Middle East. But the dynamics, unfortunately, for why being they are not there.
You talked about the authoritarian regimes, but it seems that authoritarianism is the most resilient character of the regimes in the region. Is it something part of also, like, it's a little bit difficult to say, but is it the society that is accepting authoritarianism, or that, like, the politics or consciousness of the region is not advanced enough to transform this authoritarianism into democracy?
Actually, there are also world conditions. Just take what happened in Spain, in Portugal, and in Greece between 74 and 78. We had a series of democratic revolutions in these countries, but at that moment, democracy was quite attractive, worldwide speaking, and European Union was quite attractive. And the left-wing movements were quite strong, and the left-wing movement played a very important role in the democratization of Spain, Portugal, and Greece. Today, they are not in this case. So the world conditions have changed. We have Iran and Turkey, but we have also Russia. We have also China. We have the rise of the radical left-wing movements in Europe. We have the phenomenon of Trumpism in the United States. So the world conditions have entirely changed. But I would say also that probably we are not anymore in simply under authoritarian rules as that was the case in the 1960s or even part of 1970s. Maybe one can mention the existence of authoritarian rule in Egypt and in Tunisia. That's obvious. And we can say that a classical authoritarian regime does exist also in Algeria, in Morocco. A half authoritarian regime does exist, but when you take actually these countries like Syria and in Iraq, you see not only the very strong militia powers, and militia power is not an authoritarian regime, it is something else. Not only the militia powers, but we see also the disintegration of the societies. The societies themselves, they are disintegrated. Just remember that in 2014, we had the rise of the Islamic States, call it whatever you want, Daesh or whatever you want, and Islamic State has been successful just because a city like Mosul, 1,300,000 people with 90,000 armed men did not resist. Recently, Aleppo fall, and immediately after that was Damascus, because these cities didn't resist. So we have a kind of destruction of the societies themselves. And when the states are so weak or disintegrated, and when the societies are so disintegrated, what happens is what Ibn Khaldun has predicted already in the 14th century. The margins, which are capable of producing a lot of violence, they can produce new actors, and these extremely violent actors can succeed. So the first element that we have to take into account is this phenomena. And the victory of the militia powers is this victory of the margins. And the second element which intervenes, when you take actually Turkey or Iran, you are not facing anymore a classical authoritarian regime, but a new form of anti-democratic regime of the 21st century. Just listen to Khamenei and listen to Erdogan, but that will be also the case of Putin. You have a very aggressive discourse. They present themselves as the anti-liberal alternative against the liberal, democratic, bourgeois, whatever you can call it, democracy. They do not believe in the Westphalian logic. What is Westphalian logic? Westphalian logic is the logic of the treaties that have ended the 30 years old 30 years war in Europe in 1648, and which accepts the principles of the states as sovereign entities. But for Khamenei or for Erdogan, the state does not count. The state is only the emanation of the nation. And what is important is the organic, almost biological rights of the nation. And the war is wanted, is wished by the nation itself. It is always a war of survival, and it's not the war of the state as such. All these evolutions actually, they are quite recent evolutions. So that's why I will say that we have still authoritarian rules in the Middle East, Algeria, once again, Egypt or Tunisia. Elsewhere, we have a much more dramatic situation.
Coming back to this dramatic situation that's happening in the Middle East, like certain countries have been trying to expand their politics, their hegemony. Iran, Turkey, and now Israel is clearly doing that. However, it seems that the expansion of Iran has already failed, and Turkey is also in a fragile situation. And although Israel has been successful in a way to, disband or dismantle its adversaries in the region, however, is also Israel is turning into an authoritarian regime. Like genocide is being committed right now in Gaza. At the same time, it's also becoming a pariah country because the international community seems to be quite angry, like step by step. Just a few days ago, the International Association of the Scholars of Genocide, they also recognized Gaza as a genocide. So it seems that like time for the Middle East powers and these authoritarian leaders is that they're instead of like transforming their society, they are becoming even more aggressive. And how to, is there a way that, society can reorganize themselves? Because you talked about the margins, although certain margins have been anti-democratic as well, like as you mentioned in the case of ISIS, but there are also in the margins, there are also voices of the decentralization, of democracy, and the minorities are also rising in Iran, in Syria, in Iraq already, and in Turkey as well, as we have seen for decades. So how can we predict it under the influence of the democratic forces in the margin, these regimes to surrender to some democratic transformation?
Actually, in your questions, there are two questions. First, the analysis of these powers. And I think that these powers, when you take them, they are extremely cynical, paying no attention at all to the human life, and being able to destroy their own societies if necessary. Because they think that they are the incarnation of the nation. The nation is a transhistorical body, which is not a historically delineated body, and the interest of the transnational, transhistorical nations are almost biological nation interests. And these regimes, at the same time, they are victims of what the Greeks called hubris, the idea of invincibility, the idea of a total and limitless power. And this idea of hubris inevitably poses a lot of problem to them. We saw that in the case of Iran. You mentioned Turkey. I think that Turkey is much more fragile than we think. And although Israel is very strong, has never been so strong in the region in the Middle East, at least militarily speaking, Israel has become a corrupted society. And the Greeks added, when you have hubris, you also need nomos. Nomos is a feeling of moderation. If you don't have nomos, the answer will be nemesis, the revenge of gods. And I think that in the Middle East today, we are experiencing it. But this nemesis does not mean necessarily that the democratic changes that we hope, that we wish will take immediately place. As I said, no historian will make any kind of prediction, so I will not be able to see what will happen in the Middle East. But I totally agree with you on one point. There are what I could call the spaces of resistance in the societies. We see that very clearly, for instance, in the Kurdish case, both in Turkey and in Rojava, but also in Rojalat. The situation of the southern Kurdistan is a little bit different. We see that in Iran. Just take the Iranian cinema since 10 years, you will obviously see that. You have that in Turkey. You have that in the Shia communities in Iraq and in Lebanon. So everywhere, I think that we have the spaces of resistance. And these spaces of resistance, they are not only spaces of resistance against hubris, against the Thanatos, the god of death. They are also the spaces of creation of new meanings, new alternatives, political alternatives, administrative alternatives, economic alternatives. They are spaces of imagining a new future, particularly for the youth. And while I will not make any kind of prediction for the future, I would heavily insist on the necessity of preserving these spaces of resistance and making them articulated with each other. So these spaces of resistance for well-being, they are quite isolated spaces. And I think that it is extremely important, notwithstanding what will happen tomorrow in these countries, that these spaces are articulated. And this articulation means articulation also among the generations, among the genders, to some extent also among the class relations. So I think that if we have to imagine the future of the Middle East, for well-being, it is quite dark. We see that, but that does not mean that at least the political imagination required for another Middle East is not there.
Later, as you said, like the regimes are very brutal, but they are not strong. The regimes like in Iraq as well, in Turkey, in Syria, we just saw like last year, in a matter of hours, the entire, this brutal regime collapsed. And Iran, whenever there are a small protest in one of the cities, the protests are becoming much bigger, and the Iranian regime is unable to address the demands of the protesters on one side. On the other side, it's using the most brutality to suppress. In Iraq, like the majority of the Iraqi people, they are not happy with none of the governments. There are, constantly people are protesting in Turkey, in Egypt. Like in Egypt, although you see that after years there's a huge silence, however, the population is the most angry against their own system. So, as you said, these regimes are undergoing in their times of like a crisis of legitimacy. But it's the matter of whether the newborn will be something democratic or the continuity of this authoritarianism. And how the left, the progressive forces, the democratic forces, and also these democratic resisting groups in the margins, can survive in this brutal, volatile region. Like if you talk about Syria, now we see somehow Rojava, and also like the Syrian Democratic Forces, they're a sort of hope of the region, as you said in one of the interviews recently. However, they're also surrounded by brutal regimes, be on the side, be the like non-armed groups like ISIS, or the new regime in Syria, the HTS-led government, or the regime in Turkey, like the Turkish regime. At the same time, with this global transformation, the new right is becoming stronger. Like Trump, all in a matter of minutes, he may decide order the forces in Syria to withdraw. So how these democratic resisting spaces can survive in this volatile, brutal area?
It is very difficult to answer to this question. For while being, what we see is that these spaces of resistance and hope, to some extent, are islands. And they have to cease to be islands. They have to become much more integrated than the islands or archipels are. I think that the question that you ask is, first of all, the question of the survival. Each day they survive, that's a day more allowing them to imagine the future. That's why it is very important, for instance, in the Rojava, to prevent at any cost a Turkish aggression. Because Turkey has not abandoned its project, her project of destroying the Rojava. For that, you need a lot of pragmatic steps. For that, you need inevitably a cooperation with the Americans, an American protection. For that, you need diplomacy. For that, you need military tools. You need a lot of things. But if you take the long run, I think that for well-being, the most important thing is to survive and to break down the position of Ireland in order to get integrated with other forces. How? I will not be able to answer to this question. But I know that, for instance, in the Syrian case, there are now connections between the Rojava and the Durzi community. In other historical conditions, we would say that maybe the Durzi community is not necessarily a progressive community. But today, it is a community which is threatened in its very existence. You mentioned, for instance, the case of Rojalat, the Iranian Kurdistan. In Iranian Kurdistan, there is a very strong but yet passive Kurdish resistance. And we know that this Kurdish resistance now is to some extent in relation with the resistance, plural resistance in Sistan Balochistan. So for while being, I think that what we can do is to ensure the survival of these spaces. Once again, we are not in the conditions of 1974, 1978. During this period, democracy was very attractive. Democratic forces were quite strong. Left-wing movement was quite strong in Europe. Today, that's not the case. Democracy is extremely fragile, even in Europe. In many European countries, democracy does not create any form of trust in itself, any sort of belief in itself. In many countries, we all observe right-wing movements, radical right-wing movements, they are winning momentum. So the worldwide conditions, they are not the most, let's say, favorable conditions today. But still, in spite of this evolution, as I said, at least preserving these spaces in the Middle East. And these spaces, they are the spaces of resistance, but also, as I said, they are spaces of hope. They are the spaces of creation of new meanings. They are spaces of a deconstruction, political, but also syntactic and symbolic deconstruction of authoritarianism, of the past experiences.
Coming back to how the Kurdish people or Kurdish leadership in general or Kurdish movements can survive in this volatile region, a brutal region. And one of the mechanisms have been the peace process between the Kurds and also these dominant nations or dominant nation states in the region. One most recent peace process or peace initiative is between Turkey and the PKK, which is led by Abdullah Öcalan in Imrali prison. And I just read today, I think it was Pervin Buldan who said Rojava is a red line for Öcalan. However, it seems also Rojava to be a red line for the Turkish state. And we know that from the prison writings or the prison notice, negotiation notice in 2015, that one of the reasons why the peace talks between the PKK and the Turkish state collapsed was both was Rojava was a red line for Erdogan as well as for Öcalan. So now we are in this catch-22 situation or this dilemma. On one side, the Kurds want peace. On the other side, if they want peace, they should further compromise on Rojava. Seems so. And I have seen from your writing and from your perspectives, insights about the peace initiative, you are a little bit more critical than certain people. Like, for example, I have been very optimistic about because I thought now it is the Middle East transforming, the political consciousness of the Turkish leadership is have realized that it's time for peace. Because when I saw Davlat Bahçeli coming to the parliament, that saying Öcalan should come to the parliament to to talk about peace and to establish a democratic society, that was a surprise for me. So, what's your take on the peace process or peace initiative in Turkey?
I think that one of the most important questions for the Kurds is to becoming subjects, the collective subjects of their own fate, of their own history, to having their own capacity of reading their past, imagining their future, to have a political imagination. That's a collective identity. That's a collective force or group, whatever you can imagine. And that's basically nationhood. Without or with or without states, that's an issue of nationhood, a community that imagines itself as a nation and therefore does not consider itself as an object, but as a subject. And the Kurdish issue was always, since 100 years, the issue of ceasing to be an object in order to become a subject. And I think that this saw, compared to the 1980s, for instance, during which we were not even sure that the Kurds would survive as a collective group, as a collective subject. Today, we have an Iraqi Kurdistan and we have a Rojava. And that's the process of becoming subject. And I think that this issue of becoming object and subject is also very obvious for Ankara and for Erdogan. You mentioned 2020, 2014, 2015. You are absolutely right. What Erdogan rejected during this period was that the Kurds would want to become the subjects of their own history and their own fate. In 2014, 2015, we were not in the context of a genocide, not even in 2019. But actually, you can make some comparisons with 1914, 1915 with the Armenian genocide. The Turkish discourse during this period is to the Armenians, we do recognize you. You do exist. You have even been unjust vis-a-vis you. But now that this recognition has taken place, you have to be at the service of the Turkish nation. While for the Armenians, the issue was not becoming being at the service of the Turkish nation, but to imagining themselves as a collective subject and to transforming the Ottoman Empire. 2014, 2015, you have an exactly similar pattern. Erdogan's discourse is, we do accept you, the Kurds, you do exist in Turkey and in the Middle East. We have been also, to some extent, unjust vis-a-vis you. But now that we have recognized you, you have to be at the service of the Turkish Sunni nation. So it means you have to become objects of the Turkish nation. While the Kurdish discourse during this period was, both in Rojava and in Turkey, they are subjects of our own history. And today in Turkey, my impression is that, of course, Turkey recognizes the Kurdish issue, but at the conditions that the Kurds do not want to become the subjects of their own history, that the Kurds accept to be confined to the role of an object of the Turkish nation. And my impression also is that in Rojava, no Kurdish leaders does want to continue to become as object of a power, a foreign power, and particularly of the Turkish power.
Beautifully put it. However, it's impossible for the Turkish state to be able to continue its assimilation policies of policy of denial of the Kurdish question and the Kurdish existence, and as Kurdish as a political entity in Turkey for the last 100 years. So how Turkish state also will be able to overcome this dilemma? Because it's clear that the Kurds will not accept that. And even though like there are negotiations and several people or many people also think that, okay, Öcalan eventually may surrender to the Turkish demands, but it's clear Öcalan is not surrendering. The PKK is not surrendering. The political consciousness of the Kurdish people in Turkey is very much, advanced. The DEM party, they are really doing quite good politics in Turkey. They are, in a way, the DEM party is becoming a sort of the future for politics in Turkey, if the Turkish society wants to have a democratic state. So how Turkey also can overcome this dilemma?
For a while being, at least, the Turkish political class is not in a democratic mood. Because when you see what happens in Turkey, the evolution, the arrest of the opposition leaders, the discourses, we are really far away from any kind of democratic perspective. And actually, concerning even the Kurdish question itself, when you take the official discourse, either the discourse of Erdogan or the discourses of Bahçeli, you see that for them, the Kurdish question is first a question of terror. And they say they are facing in this country an issue of terror since 40 years. And if PKK surrenders, the issue of terror will be over. While we all know that the Kurdish issue is a national issue, that the Kurdish issue is an issue in Turkey since 100 years, even more. You can go back to the Tanzimat period of 1839, and we know that there is a Kurdish issue in the Middle East. Second, for the official discourse in Turkey, one should prevent imperialism and Zionism to manipulate the Kurdish issue. Once again, you see, the issue itself is not accepted. The Kurds are considered as an object that imperialism or Zionism can manipulate. While we know that the Kurdish issue has nothing to do with Zionism, the Kurdish issue existed long before the emergence of the State of Israel, long before the emergence of the United States as a world power. And if you have to mention imperialism, the Lausanne Treaty was the division of Kurdistan between Turkey and two imperialist powers, Great Britain and France. And the third, the issue of Ummah, the Muslim Brotherhood, saying that the Kurds are Muslims, the Turks are Muslims, and the Arabs are Muslims. So within the Ummah, we will create one single structure under the leadership of Turkey. While we know that a national issue is not an issue of the religious brotherhood, it is an issue of recognition. It is an issue of freedom. It is an issue of equality, of the recognizing the other as existing. And that's what happened, for instance, in Spain between 75, 78. And in Spain, the issue of democracy has been accepted as an issue as a legitimate issue. And the Catalan and Basque issues have been accepted as national issues. No one could say in Spain they are all Christians. And if we are Christians, so we have to create a Christian brotherhood. I think that this issue of linking the Kurdish issue to the Ummah structure is not, is simply it means that the Erdogan government does not understand or does not want to understand the very meaning of the Kurdish issue.
The discourse of Ummah, like, because that was also part of peace process in 2015. Is it just a discourse to convince the Turkish society? Because like after 100 years of indoctrinating this society that these people are terrorists, they are, mountainous Turks, they are inhumane, and then all in a sudden you consider them as equals. It's not easy to be accepted by this society that has been indoctrinated. So to my understanding, it's like more a discourse to convince people rather than to be the status policy to win over the Kurdish population through the Ummah discourse, because it's very much clear the ideology or the perspectives of the Kurdish politics in Turkey is completely different from Erdogan's or Davlat Bahçeli's. And the Kurds, the ones who are part of the Kurdish politics, or those Turks who are part of the Kurdish political party, majority of them are, they are Muslims, but they don't consider themselves as practicing Muslims. So for me, it's more like a discourse to convince people. Do you think it's real state policy?
Probably there is something deeper in it, because when you take the formation of the Turkish ideology, what I can call the Turkish ideology, which goes back actually to Abdülhamit period, Abdülhamit II, it means 1876 and 1909. Already during this period, you have a pan-Islamic discourse, but this pan-Islamic discourse is at the same time a pan-Turkish discourse. Thereafter, when you take the main founder of the Turkish nationalism, Ziya Gökalp, in his objective, you have also that. And in the end of 1970s, in Turkey, there was a very important intellectual group that one can compare to the Opus Dei in Franco Spain. And this intellectual group has developed a thesis called the Turkish Islamic synthesis. And this synthesis meant that Turkishness cannot exist without Islam, and Islam cannot exist without Turkishness. So transforming the Turk into the leading nation of the Islamic world, and at the same time reinforcing Turkishness with Islam. And actually, this discourse was also the discourse of Khomeini at that moment, and that's the discourse of Khamenei since then. So you do not dissolve the nation, but you reinforce the nation through the religion, and you put your nation at the position of the leadership of a religious brotherhood. And I think that for Erdogan, it is absolutely obvious. He is a heir of this tradition of Turkish Islamic synthesis. For him, the Turkish nation cannot exist morally, ethically without Islam. And at the same time, the Turks have as historical mission to lead the Islamic world. At least the Islamic world, which was dominated by the past by the Ottoman Empire. He has absolutely not abandoned this idea. Just remember, when Muhammad Ali, the boxman, died, Erdogan took his private plane, went there. He has been humiliated because nobody accepted his presence as a leader. Was obliged to return back because for him, the Americans, Muslims, they are of course under the Turkish leadership. And once again, the idea of hubris, this thinking that you have a unlimited power. You face a lot of empirical defeats, but once again, you do not abandon this idea. So that's why I would say that there is something deeper in that. But for the Kurds, the brotherhood of Ummah has no meaning at all. By the way, why should not the Shia be a part of the Ummah and only the Sunnis? Why the Armenians would not be in this community of brotherhood, or the Greeks? They were also the former Ottomans, and the Armenians, they have submitted that they have been subject of a genocide. For the Kurds, the question is the question of course, of brotherhood or sisterhood, but a democratic brotherhood or democratic sisterhood, not a religious brotherhood.
The Kurdish society is also very diverse. We have the Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Alawis, Yarsans, Yazidis, Shabaks, etc. So it's not the Kurds will not be able to be part of an ummah which is not democratic. And so you meant let's because we just have a few more minutes for let's talk about a little bit about you mentioned that about the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamism in the region. At some point, Wahhabism was becoming popular in the region. Some point, Al Qaeda, jihadists, and then Muslim Brotherhood, and then liberal Islamism in Turkey. And then now, eventually, the jihadists became like normalized in Syria. However, although we see that like Muslim Brotherhood has been suppressed in the region, in the Arab world, but still the Islamism as a political ideology is still strong. However, there are also some changes within the society because in Syria, like I think it was today I saw a survey where over 60% do not want Islamism to be the ideology of the system. However, my question is, how can we see Muslim Brotherhood or Islamism be jihadism or Wahhabism or just political Islam in the region, in the new Middle East that's being reshaped among these geopolitical recalibrations?
As I said, concerning the future, I will not be able to say something. Concerning the past, yes. The Muslim Brotherhood has been founded in 1928. It means almost 100 years ago. And we see since 100 years, the Muslim Brotherhood or the political Islam could not improve at any way, in any way, at any cost, the fate of the Muslim societies. Take the economy, take the security, the issue of security, take the issue of democracy, take the issue of justice, take the issue of technological development, take the issue of corruption. Whatever the answer that you take, you see that the Islamists, they were not able at all in any of their families, internal families, either conservative political Islam or Wahhabism or jihadism, to fulfill anything. And I think that one should stop at one moment and just make a balance sheet of the past. Why is the Middle East in this stage, in this state, in this lamentable situation? And I think that many actors do have a responsibility. The Arab nationalism has a definite national responsibility, because when you see, for instance, the Ba'ath ideology was basically a national socialist ideology. Take the Pan-Arabism, take the Arab left-wing movements of 1950s, 1960s, and Islamism. At one point, I think that there is necessary to just evaluate the past. And this evaluation of the past shows us that at least until now, the Islamists could not suggest anything to the Middle East and not prevent and improve anything. That does not mean that one should suppress the Islamists or repress militarily the Islamists. I have never been in favor of destroying the Muslim Brotherhood. That's another issue. On the contrary, I think that we need secular societies in which religious sensibilities, they have their right to express themselves. But at one point, I think that the Islamists have to also ask themselves why the Muslim world is in this situation.
question, and also concerning your last comments. Recently, Ahmad al-Shara, the new, president of Syrian regime, he said he criticized Islamism, Aruba, like Arab nationalism, that they have not been able to produce anything. And he has been very pragmatic in recreating his image from a jihadi Islamist to a sort of modern Arab liberal Islamist leader. And can we trust a former Islamist jihadist who has used violence against minorities, like very brutally, and now he's the president is his discourse is just a discourse, or a discourse to consolidate power, or do you believe that, like, can we trust such kind of recreation of personal identities?
Uh, I will just see the praxis, not the discourses, but the praxis. And in the practice, I see three things. First, he might criticize the Arab nationalism, and at the same time, I think that he is in the continuity of the Arab nationalism. I mentioned in Turkey the existence of the Turkish Islamic synthesis. In the Arab world, we have also this Arabic Islamic synthesis. And even Michel Aflaq, the founder of Baas, who was not a Muslim, has integrated Islam into the Arab national identity. And I think that in my reading, as far as I see in the discourses and particularly in practices of Ahmed al-Shara, you have that. Second element, Ahmed al-Shara is the leader of a militia force, and he has been legitimized by 18 militia forces, among them many very radical Islamists. And a militia force and state structures, they are absolutely different elements. You cannot create a state, a legal state, a rational state. I don't even speak about democracy. Even an authoritarian legal and rational state cannot be based on the militia forces. And today, the Ahmed al-Shara regime is based on that. And the third, my impression is that in the practice, Ahmed al-Shara is still trying to create a kind of Islamic emirate, Sunni Islamic emirate. He might tolerate for a while being the secular forces, but when you see his policy in Sueda and in the Derzi territories, his discourse and practice is obviously that you are the heretics. Either you will become Muslim Sunnis like us, or you will be exterminated. You are not a part of the Ahl al-Kitab. What does it mean, Ahl al-Kitab? The Jews and the Christians, they are considered as Ahl al-Kitab, the communities of book, and they are protected by Islam if they accept their subordination. But the Durzis cannot be part of that. So exterminations. Or the Syrian Alawites. You are not a part of the Islam. You have betrayed Islam, the Sunni Islam. So your extermination is licit, halal. So we can exterminate you. And that means that whatever his discourse is, his praxis is the praxis of an Islamic emirate.
Plan, thank you so much, Zorspas, for your time and thoughts. Your insights really helped me and help us to see the Middle East better, and not only as a place of conflict, but also of ideas and possibilities. I hope this will not be our first interview, although I'm honored to have the first Amargi interview with you, but hopefully to see you soon again.
With pleasure.